Marta, floor is yours.
Okay, thank you.
You're recording, Yaron?
Okay, thank you so much. So, hello everyone. My name is Marta Havryshko. I'm a Holocaust scholar from Ukraine, but today I'm at Basel University, and it's my big honor and pleasure today to make introductory remarks to our wonderful event. First of all, I would like to welcome everyone who has come here today. We thank you very much. You are the force that pushes us, that gives us the motivation to continue holding our online events. Thank you so much. The topic of our conference today focuses on those violent events, tragic events, which were in fact the first shot for the final solution, and the massive extermination of Jews by the Nazis and their local collaborators, which followed. These acts of public violence committed before the eyes of Germans and local spectators were unprecedented. The pogroms were, in a sense, a hint of the impending escalation and the continuation of the entire extermination process. At the end of July 1941, Hermann Göring instructed Reinhard Heydrich to submit a plan for, as we know in quoting marks, for carrying out the final solution of the Jewish question. Soon, the mass murder of Jews and other civilians have become a daily routine for the perpetrators. Recruiting local collaborators helped the Germans to reach even the most remote places in order to carry out their violent tasks. The number of women and children who were brutally murdered also increased. The 1941 pogroms undoubtedly mark an important chapter in the history of the Holocaust. This initial aspect is critical to our understanding of the further sequence of events. I am grateful to our distinguished lectors for today, Professor Jeffrey Kopstein and Emanuel-Marius Grec. Thank you so much for being here and sharing with us your important research. And now I would like to give the floor to our moderator for today, Jan Burzlaff, a William Ekman Fellow for Holocaust Studies at Harvard University. Jan has published on pogroms and communal violence, visual history, and social relations during the Holocaust. His recent publications deal with Jews and non-Jews in the Netherlands and social dynamics and everyday life around the killing center at Belzec. I would like to mention that we are recording the session and will upload it to our website. And please keep your microphones on mute, and please post your questions to our panelists in the chat. As always, I want to thank you, Daniela Ozacky, Boaz Cohen, Yaron Pasher, and Jan Burzlaff for their organization. Thank you so much, Jan. The Zoom is yours.
Thank you very much, dear Marta. Hello to everybody. I hope you're all doing well. Welcome to this wonderful event. As Marta just said, the subject of neighbor-on-neighbor violence, including pogroms, has become an important feature of research, most importantly after Jan Gross's Neighbors in 2001, which has generated extensive polemics and led scholars to pay considerable attention to both civilian-on-civilian violence and non-Germans' substantial participation in the persecution. One could say that we are now in a post-neighbor environment. And what has come into focus, in particular, as Marta said, is the wave of brutal, intimate violence after the onset of Operation Barbarossa on June 22nd, 1941. We will hear two fascinating papers today. And as a kind of introduction to them, I would like to offer three keys to send off these two fascinating papers. First, the idea of mass violence. I believe the pogroms and intimate violence have recently seen a surge in interest because they suffered a long time from two gaps. First, they were long time considered events on the periphery, often in small, remote localities in Eastern Europe, where scholars were mostly interested in top-down Nazi policies. And second, the genocidal intent is hard to establish when neighbors attack neighbors, especially in June and July 1941, without the hindsight of what was to come afterwards. Therefore, we have decided to title the event Mass Violence. What we will hear are acts of incredible violence that move us collectively towards a more comprehensive picture of the Nazi system during the Holocaust, embedded in local contexts. The second key is intimacy that we should watch for. We know that these acts were done by people who knew their Jewish neighbors by name, by face, even by a shared history. Most often they did not meet each other in private, but in business, on markets, in shops, and on the streets, in villages and towns. This was intimate violence, and a warm shout out here to Natalia Alexion, a friend of the program, who has demonstrated precisely the intimate nature of such ties and their breakdown in Eastern Galicia. We should see how the two papers frame these social networks, intimacy, and social isolation. And the third key to watch, the tools and methods. Finally, we see interdisciplinary social science come back to the central event of modern mass violence, the Holocaust. Social scientists have so much to give to us, mostly historians. And this is why we invited Jeff, a political scientist by training, who is also admittedly highly engaged with historians, and Emanuel, a historian. I'm therefore delighted to introduce Jeff Kopstein, who is professor of political science at the University of California at Irvine, and a dear mentor of mine. Previously, he held faculty appointments at the University of Colorado at Boulder and University of Toronto, where he was the director of the Center for Jewish Studies. He's the author of 2 books, 3 edited volumes, and over 60 articles. And his work focuses on inter-ethnic violence, voting patterns, minority groups, and anti-liberal tendencies in civil society. Particular attention paid to European and Russian Jewish history. He has published with Jason Wittenberg, Intimate Violence, Anti-Jewish Pogroms on the Eve of the Holocaust in 2018, and an edited volume with Jelena Bodic and Susan Welsh entitled Politics, Violence, Memory, The New Social Science of the Holocaust, forthcoming with Cornell University Press later this year. His paper today is entitled The Pogroms of 1941 in Comparative Perspective. Dear Jeff, we are delighted to have you. The floor is yours.
Well, I can't tell you what an honor it is. I've followed this group for a while, and I'm really delighted to be invited. And thank you to Daniela for showing up, from Marta for the introduction of the event, Jan for the beautiful introduction, for Boaz, I guess, as kind of presiding over it all. So I'm going to load up my talk here, so I can stay within my 20-25 minutes. So thank you. Today, I'm going to talk to you about the pogroms of 1941 that occurred in the first 6 weeks of the war on the Eastern Front, as the Germans passed through quickly and tried to induce the local populations of Lithuanians, Belarusians, Ukrainians, and Romanians, and other groups to turn violently against their Jewish neighbors. For the past decade or so, I've been trying to understand why some communities became violent and others did not during those initial weeks of the war. And together with my co-author, Jason Wittenberg, I found that some of the very same factors that appear to explain pogrom violence in other times and places, even in violence that doesn't involve Jews at all, were also driving factors in the summer of 1941. But before I turn to that, since I know that almost everyone here watching here is a historian, let me say a few words about social science and the Holocaust, because Jan prefaced that in his introductory comments. It's perhaps a curious feature of Holocaust studies that while some of the most influential earliest studies of the Holocaust were undertaken by philosophers and social scientists rather than historians, sometime in the 1960s, this all began to change as historians undertook and performed path-breaking work and really led the field, and that continues to this day. While social scientists, on the other hand, they lost interest. But the lion's share, to repeat, of great work on the Third Reich and the Holocaust was once written by social scientists and philosophers: Frankl, Neumann, Arendt, Horkheimer, Adorno, Brocker, and yes, many of you probably know Raoul Hilberg, who has a degree in political science. In psychology, Gordon Allport Philip Zimbardo, and of course, Stanley Milgram, whose work has been used by historians, Christopher Browning most prominently. Why social scientists lost interest is itself a fascinating question that has more to do with politics and sociology of knowledge than with any inherent logic of Holocaust studies. And I can turn to that in the Q&A if anybody's interested. But this has changed, and a new generation of research has appeared over the past decade. One of the big breakthroughs in Holocaust research among social scientists revolved around the insight that rather than being one big event that has to be explained as a whole, the Holocaust was a series of event categories. I say event categories. Now that sounds like jargon, I know, and of course I'm a social scientist, that's what I do. But it simply reflects first that nobody knew there was going to be a Holocaust even as the Holocaust was happening. It's only in retrospect that we use that term. And it did happen, as it did happen, it involved a series of events. Think about, roughly in chronological order, stigmatization, residential segregation, confiscation of property, pogrom violence, ghettoization, mass shootings, transports, and of course the world of the concentration camp and the death camp. And that's just a partial list. Seen this way, the Holocaust was not one big thing, but could only occur because these many event categories took place at all. Now, this may seem to be a simple insight, and it is, but it opens the way to collecting a great deal of information that can be usefully compared and can help us answer some important questions. The Holocaust, to repeat, is not just one big case. It is many, many thousands of cases. This fact, I mean, n does not equal 1, n equals much more than 1. This fact allows us to integrate Holocaust research much more firmly into the broader social scientific literature beyond the focus on genocide and extend it to ethnic violence, riots, mass killing, lynching, residential segregation, prejudice, the list goes on. There are huge literatures on each and every one of these questions in other times and places. The new generation of social scientists working on the Holocaust believe this is important, not only because the Holocaust, as I think Marta mentioned, is the kind of the index case of violence in the modern world that provides us with the categories through which we understand so much of contemporary politics and society, but because it's important to integrate this research into the broader human corpus of knowledge of analogous, but certainly not identical events. This comparative, let's call it a micro turn in research, has been immensely productive and has led to a great deal of new work on the Holocaust that looks at things in new ways. So I'm going to start with my own work on pogroms. This work has appeared in a book and a series of articles, most of it written with Jason Wittenberg at Berkeley. And to repeat what was already noted, in the summer of 1941, as you know, the Germans passed through much of Eastern Europe, the East European borderlands, very quickly before turning their attention in subsequent months to the killing of Jews. They attempted to turn the locals during this 6-week period against their Jewish neighbors. In some places they succeeded, and in other places they did not. We know this because they occasionally complained, for example, in the Einsatzgruppenberichte, about their failure to instigate anti-Jewish violence during the 6-week period. This was an exceptionally shocking and violent turn of events in the region. And in the case of the Polish eastern borderlands, that eventually, was Western Belarus and Western Ukraine, these were the core of the areas that I've been studying. Wittenberg and I were inspired by Jan Gross's book, Neighbors, where in his words, half the town killed the other half the town. And we went on to read hundreds of testimonies drawn primarily from the 7,200 testimonies at the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw, but also in several other archives, many of which the people here already know and are familiar with, in an effort to determine where pogroms occurred and where they did not. We ended up with a data set of approximately 2,000 communities in Western Belarus and Western Ukraine, where we found that 219 pogroms had taken place in the summer of 1941. That is, in about 10% of places, the small towns and larger cities of the region. We believe this count to be a minimum because it is possible that we missed some. We almost certainly have missed some. Of course, what we mean by a pogrom here is primarily not the behavior of the occupying Germans, as important as that is, but instead the local population targeting their Jewish neighbors. And it is true that sometimes both locals and Germans were among the perpetrators during the chaos of the pogroms of summer 1941. One might question the use of the word pogrom here, because historically, pogroms took place in a very specific, mostly Russian context. And the word itself, of course, as you know, comes from the Russian gromit, to smash or break. But this in itself is interesting, because both the Jewish communities during 1941, immediately after the war in their testimonies, and the Germans themselves used this word, indicating that rather than plans for wholesale extermination, at this stage, many, many people were still understanding this violence in categories familiar from a different era. In fact, given that this anti-Jewish violence took place before the Germans had actually decided on the wholesale extermination of the Jewish people, it's not always clear to me that it's best categorized as part of the Holocaust. Perhaps it's a prelude, but nobody really knew there was going to be a Holocaust at this stage, and that fact should provide a note of caution regarding interpretations that look backward from the endpoint. In any case, it's a subject of legitimate scholarly debate, and I try to join this debate. In our research, we collected data on every one of these 2,000 communities where pogroms either did or did not occur, in an attempt to determine what caused the violence. We attempted to document how many Jews and non-Jews were in each place, their religions, their socioeconomic status, that is, whether Jews were richer or poorer than their neighbors, their access to capital and financial infrastructure, the depth of political anti-Semitism, and of course, the political commitments of both the Jews and the non-Jews in every community in the region, using the result of elections all the way back into the early 1920s. Rather than rehash everything we found, let me just spend a few minutes on how this sort of research can help us have some humility for what we think we understand about what happened. The data brings into question some of the most cherished hypotheses of Holocaust research. First, the presence of the Germans. It's clear, and anybody who studied this knows this, the Germans were rather thinly spread on the ground. There weren't really enough of them to actually carry out all of this. And in many cases, the pogroms occurred before the Germans arrived and even after they left. So in that sense, while the Germans and the beginning of the war was a necessary condition for all of this, it was certainly not a sufficient condition. And in many cases, it may not have been needed at all. Second, the presence of the Soviets. The same caveat applies here. All of these pogroms, or almost all of them, occurred in areas that had been occupied by the Soviet Union between 1939 and 1941. And indeed, when the Soviets left, in many cases, and we know this from Eastern Galicia, that they left behind NKVD prisons stuffed full of the corpses of largely Ukrainian nationalists, but not only Ukrainian nationalists, ordinary Ukrainians, Poles, and even Jews. But the problem is that the Soviets, their NKVD prisons do not map onto the pogrom map very well. And there's also no evidence at all that Soviet rule was any worse or any more severe in places that eventually had pogroms than places that did not. And in fact, communism, as measured by the vote for the communists before the war, before 1939, appears to have provided a sort of immunizing effect, because what communism was a kind of a non-liberal form of universalism, right? One of the only ideologies on the ground where Jews and non-Jews could sort of get along. Then there's, of course, popular anti-Semitism. And in the case of the Eastern borderlands, you have the National Democrats, the Polish National Democrats, and you have, of course, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. I'm sorry, there's a siren. In fact, the problem is not that anti-Semitism is not present. The problem is that it's too present. It can't distinguish where pogroms happened from where it did not. That is, there are lots of places that did not have pogroms, where anti-Semitism appears to be very strong, as measured both, so for example, by the vote for the National Democrats. If anti-Semitism were the cause of pogroms, we should have seen many more pogroms than we actually saw. Remember, there was only 10%. The same goes for avarice and greed. Undoubtedly a factor. There's all kinds of testimonies of locals grabbing Jewish goods, Jewish apartments, valuables, peasants coming in from the countryside with wagons to take stuff. But the differences in wealth and access to capital don't appear to have exercised a completely universal impact, although there is some impact there. But it's really not a very good explanation because, again, as I said, this does not appear to be a variable. It appears to be a constant, and you can't explain a variable with a constant. So what determined where they occurred versus where they did not? Well, it's not going to surprise you to know that as a political scientist, we naturally gravitated to political factors. And we found significant differences in pre-existing political polarization in communities that had pogroms compared to those did not, especially those that had both strong Polish National Democratic votes and a strong Zionist vote, which was in this part of Poland clearly the strongest party, as measured by the percentage of the votes that they got from the Jewish community, which for us indicates that under those conditions, the two communities saw themselves as really quite separate and not combinable, not compatible even. This sort of divide indicated a deep and contentious dispute over the fundamental question of whose state was it, and whether the Poles and Ukrainians would monopolize the cultural and political spheres in their own future societies. Now note, saying that pogroms tended to occur where the Zionist vote was strong all the way back into the 1920s is not blaming the Jews for their own victimization. I need to repeat that. I'm not blaming the Jews for their own victimization. That would be silly. The Jews had just as much a right to their own nation-building project as any other group, including Poles and Ukrainians and Belarusians, etc. They did not deserve to be beaten, raped, robbed, and killed largely by their own non-Jewish neighbors in the summer of 1941. But in a significant minority of communities, this is what occurred. Now, I realize that the sort of account I'm offering here and the way I'm phrasing it may sound unlikely to some people, especially historians. The reviews of the work show that, and I appreciate that. The idea that pre-existing political polarization could have influenced events on the eve of the Holocaust may seem far-fetched, but that's only because we know now of the horrors that would happen next. The idea of settling scores with future political rivals may have made some sense at the time. It's true those who actually carried out the pogroms were driven by a gigantic range of motives, running the gamut of human subjectivity, ranging from anti-Semitism to greed to pure depravity of all sorts. But where these motives, which are universally spread across humanity, where they could actually be acted upon, I maintain, is driven by communal level factors. And that is what are the kinds of places that they occurred in. By extension, much of Holocaust research, let's say on rescuers, looks at the role of rescuers and priests and others who helped Jews. But the fact of the matter is that it was easier to help Jews in some places than in others. The distribution of virtue and altruism and depravity, our research suggests, was not entirely random. It just so happens that Jews were much less likely to receive communal protection from pogrom violence in the summer of 1941 in places where they lived in larger numbers, where they had access to their own communal banking institutions, and especially where they were politically organized in a way that indicated to their non-Jewish neighbors that they were unlikely to join the local nation-building project. This is not to say that politics and political polarization is the only factor behind pogroms, but it's an important one. And it's one that has not been addressed by the literature before, and that our methodology at least allows us to make a first pass at. So I'm going to conclude by saying, I don't want to overstate our findings, but this is the sort of research, this sort of research is the kind that the new generation of social scientists are now engaging in. I just want to mention a few names. Daniel Solomon has partially replicated and extended the findings of the pogrom study to our understanding of the distribution of synagogue destruction and anti-Jewish violence on Kristallnacht. He's a graduate student at Georgetown. He's been doing a fantastic dissertation. Or, of course, Yevgeny Finkel's work on different sorts of Jewish behavior and survival in ghettos based on pre-existing political and social conditions and divides. Or Robert Brown's fascinating findings that Jews in the Netherlands were much more likely to receive assistance in evading capture from local minority churches, that is from Protestant churches in Catholic areas and Catholic churches in Protestant areas, than from virtually any other source. All of these scholars have proceeded in a similar way to the way I've suggested is really new, compiling hundreds of separate observations and carefully comparing the context in which the killing and salvation occurred. The Holocaust occurred in specific places, and each of these places had a backstory. And it stands to reason that this backstory can not only help us to understand the way the Holocaust transpired, where it did, but also can help us to inform other cases of mass violence, and in turn can be informed by those other cases. To take the most obvious comparisons, lynching in the American South, you might know that a third of communities never, after the end of Reconstruction, never had a lynching. And the method we've drawn upon here for understanding the differences in anti-Jewish violence can be, and indeed has been used, to understand violence in the post-bellum American South. The same goes for Hindu-Muslim riots in contemporary India that scholar after scholar has pointed to are connected intimately to political needs. The point is not to say that these things are identical, but rather to say that they can inform each other. In fact, even if you don't believe in cross-national or cross-cultural comparisons, you can still use the kinds of factors we've identified in our pogrom study to look at the determinants of anti-Jewish violence in other times and places, from antiquity through the Middle Ages to the present. In each phase, deep disputes about ownership of the polity has contributed to the facilitating communal factors that allows pogroms or intercommunal violence to occur. In fact, this sort of cross-temporal work is exactly what I'm doing right now, but that's the subject for another talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, dear Jeff, for an insightful paper, as always, and much food for thought. Please keep putting your questions in the chat. I propose we now move on to the second paper today. It comes from Emanuel-Marius Grec, who's a PhD candidate in history at Heidelberg University in Germany. He earned a BA in history from the Vasily Goldis Western University of Arad in 2013, a master's in comparative history from Central European University in Budapest, 2016, and a master's in Jewish civilizations from the Hochschule für jüdische Studien in Heidelberg, 2019. He's currently working on his dissertation entitled The Perpetrators of the Odessa Massacre, War Crimes Trials in Post-War Romania, 1944-1948. His thesis examines how perpetrators and war criminals were portrayed in Romanian war crime trials between 44 and 48. His research interests, broadly speaking, include the Holocaust in Romania, nationalism, as well as the wider history of the Jewish communities of Eastern Europe, on which he has published several pieces already. His paper today is entitled Odessa Should Have Been Torn Upside Down, the Odessa Massacre of October 1941. Thank you so much, and the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you, Jan. And thank you for being so many people here. And some of you I know only from in a virtual forum, some of you I know personally. And I thank Daniela so much for inviting me for this talk. Since it's going to be quite a short presentation, I'm going to, like 20 minutes, I'm going to put a presentation on the screen. So I'm going to share my screen now. And my presentation, it's like a PowerPoint presentation, obviously. Just a second, because I have it here. All right, I hope you can see it. Right, so my presentation has quite a lot of information on it, the reason for which I'm going to talk a bit on the side also to what I have here. Right, so this is the overview. This is the overview of my presentation. I'm going to talk a bit about the Odessa Massacre of 1941, like the facts, for those of you that are not very familiar with it. And then I'm going to analyze a bit what orders meant for the people who are involved in the massacre. How can we discuss the military versus other factors that were involved in the massacre. We're going to talk a bit about post-war trials, not because it's my own research, but also because I think the information you can get from post-war trials on the Odessa massacre are very much relevant to the massacre itself. And I'm going to insist a bit on the relationship, what I see as the key relationship between mass murder, ghettoization, and deportation. And I'm going to end with what we can learn as researchers from the year of 1941 in Romanian occupied territories. As you can probably already see, my presentation is a bit more case study driven, not so much in terms of a general overview of the Holocaust in Romania. So the reason I chose to focus on the Odessa massacre is because I see it as a potential tool of analysis for the whole of the Holocaust in Romanian occupied territories. The October massacre and the quote that Daniela suggested to me, because she heard it in my presentation in the Yad Vashem, and it's interesting because that's exactly the title that I would have put to this presentation. Odessa should have been torn upside down by now. That's the last part of the quote. Is actually a quote from General Nicolae Macic telling to another general, Constantin Trestorianu, in Odessa, that he is basically disappointed with what happened up until that point in Odessa, and the city should have been much more destroyed by that point. But I won't insist too much on that because I'll get to that in a few minutes. So these are some of the main research questions that I deal with. How can we define the groups of perpetrators? What was the relationship? How was the Jewish community seen by the Romanian army who was advancing into the city in the middle of October 1941, and how we can link the Odessa massacre to previous murder practices like cleansing the terrain, for example, in the Romanian occupied territories and afterwards, mainly the establishment of ghettos and the deportations in Transnistria. So a bit of an overview, because Odessa was occupied on the 16th of October. The battle actually started in August, and almost 30 to 35,000 Romanian soldiers died in the battle for the city, mostly because of poor morale and poor artillery preparation. The problem was that Antonescu refused to believe that his army was poorly prepared. So obviously he resorted to propaganda. One of the myths that his regime put forward was that the Soviet resistance was enforced by the Jews. He didn't go into any details about how that could have been done. He just said it, and the local military commanders on the ground had the obligation to put that message forward. It's also interesting to see what I call the civilizational nature of the Romanian mission, or what the Romanian army claimed to do was to liberate, obviously, its historic territories, and to defend a certain Romanian civilization by eliminating Jewish dominance from that area. It's also interesting to see that Odessa was never part of the so-called historic territories that the Romanian leaders wanted to proclaim. The Jewish community at the time of Odessa in October of 1941, the active Jewish community was between 80 and 90,000 people. It was much larger than that before that year, before 1941, 3 or 4 times that number, but people left either with the Soviet army or by themselves. Also because there was a tantamount fear as to what would happen when the Romanian soldiers would capture the city, because the Soviets left the city for defending in other places. And that fear came to be very much true, because the first days after occupation, so basically from October 16th to when the city fell, and October 22nd when the massacre began, witnessed mass looting, rape, murder, destruction of property. That fear was very much alive during those days. Of course, this myth that Jews have been Soviet agents is easily dispelled by scholars, especially as a historical example, that for the fact that the Soviet army had taken specifically anti-Jewish measures right before Odessa fell, having dozens of Jews executed for various reasons, out of which I'm not going to get into now. Going back to the massacre itself, so basically on a short, very short, what happened between October 16 and the 22nd, the Romanian army received multiple notifications from the German mission in Romania that the building of the former NKVD on Engels Street, number 42, might be mined. Now, it was demined, it was checked for mines and for explosives several times, including by the Germans, including by the Romanian specialists. They found nothing. However, on the 22nd of October, the building blows up shortly before 6 p.m., killing over 130 Romanian soldiers and German military personnel that were in the city, and killing Ion Glogojanu, who was the general in charge of the city. Because I mentioned names, I'm going to say that after Glogojanu's death, Constantin Trestoreanu who was his second in command, became the active general in the city. And after 8 p.m., he reports that he ordered Jews and communists to be hanged in the public square of Odessa. That was those were his words. He also says that nobody knows for sure what happened, because there is chaos and the local troops cannot prepare. And after 11 p.m., the Romanian Fourth Army, which had its center in Tiraspol, decides to send General Nicolae Macic to Odessa, but he gets there only on the 23rd. So that night, Iacobici, who was the general in Tiraspol, decides that Macic will be sent to Odessa to handle what it is called, and I quote, military reprisals, which is an important term, and I'll get to that term. Back. So Trestoreanu, immediately, who becomes the number one general in the city, immediately starts taking actions of hanging Jews and communists, as he says, even before any order was received. Actually, immediately after the explosion, there were indiscriminate executions and hangings in the city, especially directed towards anybody who was believed to be a Jew. Romanian army forces rounded up Jews many times without any specific orders, and later on moved them to a place close to Dalnik, which was on the outskirts of Odessa, where mass executions began. These executions began only after Macic came on the 23rd, the large ones, but smaller executions and hangings started immediately. As I mentioned also here, the scales of the massacres was massive, and it's a very complicated entire scene, which involved shooting, military barracks ablaze with people in them, and soldiers who actually shot anyone who tried to escape. As I will also mention, it's important to say that not every single soldier in Odessa participated in these mergers. There were the ones that refused and nothing happened to them. Macic at his trial for his crimes in Odessa actually says, and I quote him here, that don't blame soldiers for only executing the orders of their superiors. And if you want to blame somebody, blame their superiors. He also later goes and claims that not even the superiors can be blamed, but that's another issue. Now, the initial murder frenzy goes up until the October of 24th, where it starts becoming more organized, and later at the end of October and November, less organized as a ghetto is established. And then you get deportations that lasted up until spring of 1942. So as you can see, the massacre itself is the start of a process. And that's why many times I refer to the massacre in plural, as in massacres. Some soldiers call it called it the City of the Hanged. And in this, I'll briefly go over military orders. As I mentioned, when reaching Odessa, General Macic was sent there to deal with military reprisals in the city because Trestorianum is considered not forceful enough and not capable of dealing with actions in the city. Told them that, and I quote, "You're all a bunch of cowards and scaredy cats. By this time, Odessa should have been turned upside down." And then on from the 23rd to the 24th, the real massacre in terms of numbers, people killed, starts. And I want to emphasize that orders by themselves, if you look at military orders, don't tell us much about the massacre in terms of analysis or motivation for murder. Of course, you can analyze orders and you can look at them, but the relationship between perpetrator and victim is much better seen if you take a more functionalist approach from a bottom-up perspective. And this is because simple empirical data is not enough. Generals and soldiers, as well as people present on the ground, had different understandings of what a military reprisal is and even what a Jew is in some instances. So I think that's why I insisted why it's important to contextualize military orders as they were understood by regular soldiers, as opposed to how those that gave the orders did so. And this is important because only that way we can understand the role of the massacre in the overall Romanian extermination project. And if you see my PowerPoint, I'm going to put here this picture which I have, this specific one from the Yad Vashem archives. I also have it from USHMM in another file, but this one, which is from the Romanian Ministry of Defense archives. And for those of you that don't understand Romanian, and I'm going to summarize this order, this is Ion Antonescu's order for the execution of Jews in the city of Odessa. There are two interesting facts to see here. One is the date of this order, which is the 24th of October. So way after the massacres began. Second, and I'll get to this in a minute and why this is important. Second is the name to which this is addressed. First, you can see that it says for General Tataranu or Iacobici, then this is cut out and it says for General Macic, showing that this order was actually given way before Macic was decided to go to Odessa. And it shows that basically Antonescu's office purely adapted to the situation unfolding. This order contains 3 points. The first one is the execution of all Jews from Bessarabia, which were refugees in Odessa, a thing which actually happened after this order was received on the 24th. However, the most interesting point is the second one, which says that all Jews should be brought together, taking military action against them, killed, put together in a building, and the building set on fire and bombed in the same time that the Romanian soldiers had their funerals in the city, the Romanian soldiers who died from the explosion. This order is important not just because it shows the responsibility of Antonescu for the massacre, that's obvious. However, it's important because the order was given on the 24th, which is 2 days after the massacres began. It shows the importance of local commanders and how they understood and what they thought actually they should do. In other words, the order from Antonescu directly tells the people on the local people commanders what they already know or what they assumed that they know. The usage of the word communism in the order reflected the general Romanian policy towards the city, because this was a code word or more of a dog whistle for being a Jew. But mostly because the boundaries between who was a communist, who was a Jew, who was a partisan, and who was a refugee were unclear, and they were subject to local interpretations. Many times, or most of the times, the people interpreted them as killing the Jews that were in the city or whom they assumed to be Jewish. And in this sense, our orders internalized by participants is important to see, especially since this mayhem of killing during these 3 days, 22, 23, and 24, had different origins. Orders came from first from Testorianu, then from Macic, then clearly from Antonescu, but they all went together. So I think, and I believe that, and I had this discussion with Professor Vladimir Solonar, and he's right, a functionalist approach functions way better than an intentionalist approach in the Romanian case. I agree with those scholars that say that there's too much intentionalism going on when analyzing Romanian policy in occupied territories, as shown by Antonescu's order, that people already knew what to do before he gave that order. And it was frightening how close those generals came to how Antonescu wanted it. And as a caveat to that, I would like to add that Antonescu had a way of writing these orders and giving orders, making them intentionally subject for interpretation. He let his generals interpret the orders, who in turn let the soldiers interpret them, because they were aware that soldiers were afraid to refuse orders. Of course, this happened. People refused orders, and there are specific examples in post-war trials as to that. So orders are not an excuse for killing for regular soldiers. So my last 2 points that I want to make on post-war trials is that there is no specific trial solely for the Odessa massacre. Romanian post-war trials were group trials in terms of organization, not responsibility. So you won't go to the archives and find, oh, these people are responsible for Odessa massacre. You have to look in various archives and various folders to come up with an answer. If you look at the trials, military rank is mostly seen as internalized by soldiers according to how they saw mostly Jews and how they espoused anti-Semitism, but not only anti-Semitism up until that point. And in that sense, some see it on a more vertical basis, while some see or as in they could not be refused, but some interpret it on a more horizontal basis, deciding whether they should be involved in a massacre or not, for religious reasons, for moral reasons, for practical reasons, and so on. So that's why I said here that the study of orders themselves risks making the assumption that people involved had no choice and were simple cogs in a machine, which, of course, when you talk about mass murder, as it was said before, it offers a simple explanation to a complex situation. It's also important to say something that many people already know, is that not all perpetrators in Odessa, in this case, were anti-Semites, and not all anti-Semites were necessarily put on trial as killers. Many of them got away. A majority of those put on trial in Romania got away. My last point regarding mass murder is this link between what I see as mass murder, as in the Odessa massacre, the establishment of ghettos and deportations. Right before, a week before the city fell, so while the Romanian army was fighting for the city, the Romanian gendarmerie something emptying the ghetto in Chisinau in Bessarabia and preparing to send the Jews for Odessa, which were later killed, obviously, on Ion Antonescu's orders. And they also established further extermination camps and ghettos in Transnistria. So already you can see the importance of the city in the Romanian imagination. The massacre itself and what happened after cannot be separated, and they cannot be separated from the battles that preceded it. And that's why I claim that the massacre itself can be understood as a mechanism as stigmatization, murder, and deportation, which characterized much of the territories under Romanian occupation. In that sense, studying it as a case study specific can offer what I called a microcosmos of how the Holocaust in Romania happened. And of course, looking at the year of 1941, that can also be true, because the same agencies that were responsible for cleansing the terrain in June and July 1941 and later in August in Bessarabia and Northern Bukovina were also responsible for the Odessa massacre. And in that sense, what I call the Odessa specter changed the course of Romania's war. Because you can see it not as simple release acts of violence, which many people look at when they look at June and July of that year, but also it sets a new standard for understanding the Romanian war, which clearly was not just about territory. So this myth of the Romanian army simply as territory does not stand out when looking at the massacre itself and what came after. And in that sense, and I end with this, Romania's war in the East was not simply a military operation that happened parallel or together with Nazi Germany, but rather it showed the Romanian state's attempt of the war extermination in Eastern Europe, which not simply paralleled military operations, but were actually a part of it. And in that sense, and I end with this, I think that it is important to study the Holocaust in Romanian occupied territories, not as just one large extermination project, but as at case studies which can show us what that project might be. And I end with that, and I thank you for your attention. I look forward to answering questions.
Thank you so much for another wonderful paper. I suggest now we move to the Q&A, and we have really a bunch of really great questions. Why don't we start with the use of pogroms, something that Boaz just put in the chat. So for both speakers, isn't using pogroms an anachronism in each of the case studies you had?
Should I go?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, happy to go in any order. Yes, of course, it is an anachronism. The problem is that it's been adopted for scholarly use. I mean, you know, the first pogrom in history, and it's the title of the book, right, is Philo's Alexandrian description in 38 CE. And the chief scholar of that pogrom, right, the most famous one, the title of the book, it's called, you know, in Flacum, the first pogrom, right? So it's about Flaccus. So it's been adopted, and it gets used not only for earlier cases of anti-Jewish violence, but of course it's gone beyond, right? It's gone beyond Jews. And I don't see a big problem with it. I think the bigger problem, and I think, you know, is, and I'd be very interested in Emanuel's take on this, that we're using it, at least in this context, in two different ways, right? One is neighbor on neighbor violence, and that's more what I'm interested in, right? And then there are these military pogroms, right? And they're really on a kind of a continuum that is more and more involvement in the military until it becomes a purely military operation, right? And it doesn't mean it's any less worthy of study. It's just that, you know, as Boaz is, I think, pointing to quite correctly, we may be studying different things, and that's okay. So Emanuel, maybe you want to jump in on that.
Yeah, I completely agree with what Jeff said. And regarding this distinction between neighbor and neighbor pogroms and military pogroms, I think that's an important distinction to make. I don't necessarily have a problem with the term itself, although it could be seen as anachronistic, but there is a discussion, for example, should we use, in some cases, and I'm going to give Romania as an example, should we use pogrom or should we use massacre in some case? Because, for example, you had the pogrom of Bucharest, but some scholars refer to it as a massacre because it's less about looting and about destruction of personal property than it's about killing an entire population. So that's also a distinction. In Romania's case, for example, you had more military programs, right? The Iași pogrom, which was had very much state involvement, and it actually took advantage of these already rifted neighbor relationships that you mentioned, and of anti-Semitism and so on. So there you have both a military program and a neighbor-on-neighbor program. In Bucharest, it was a different one. You also have outside of Romania what could be called pogroms, for example, but could be also called massacres. You can consider, for example, right, even before Romania entered as a conquering army Bessarabia, they sent auxiliary police among the lines to incite local people to kill Jews before the Romanian army arrives. So that's another form and people just reacted and they started looting and killing, and some pogroms started there as well. So the distinction between, for example, military programs and neighbor-on-neighbor programs, it's important, but it's important also to remember that sometimes they go hand in hand.
Yeah, that really, I think that is really important addition here. We have one question we have many questions actually for Jeff about the relationship between social science, history, and everything that entails. So why don't we go ahead and ask the question that Boaz asked in the beginning? Why did social scientists lose interest in the Holocaust in the late 60s, early 70s?
So as Jan knows very well, I've just been writing about this. So it's really very fresh in my mind. And my answer is somewhat speculative because it's really asking why people aren't writing about something, right? It's kind of a history of an absence, of a silence. And one of the things is that social scientists tended to gravitate to what they thought were big general questions. So for example, in political science, the determinants of democracy and dictatorship. Why are some countries democracies? Why are some countries dictatorships? For example, it's kind of a classic question. Why are some rich and some poor? If you really wanted to make a big career in political science, right, you gravitated to those big questions. If you were Jewish and you gravitated to Jewish questions, it would be fine and no one would probably get too upset with you, but you torpedo your career. At that time, you used to. You would torpedo your career. So it's fascinating. If you go to the American Political Science Association, it's a huge association. It's much bigger than history, actually. It's got 10,000 political scientists meet on Labor Day weekend every year. And, you know, it's like going to a bar mitzvah. There are so many Jews, right? It's remarkable just by the Jewish last name test. Forget about the ones that you don't know. And what is incredible is the first panel at the American Political Science Association on the Holocaust took place in 2011 in its history. And do you know why I know that? Because I organized it, right? And it's a very strange phenomenon. But there's the kind of, you know, sociology of knowledge question, right? And interestingly, I think that was overcome by African-American studies and Latino studies and women's studies. That is, identity groups became a perfectly legitimate object of study within the American Academy over the course of the 60s and 70s, and Jewish studies and Holocaust studies benefited from that in the social sciences. So that's part of what changed. Another thing that changed is political science is a very data-driven project. And for a long time, nobody could conceptualize it except as a genocide. That is, N equals 1. Well, fortunately, there's actually not that many genocides. And so the problem is how are you going to develop a theory of so few cases, right? It's like that Monty Python skit about, I have a theory of a dinosaur. It's thin at one end, thick in the middle, and thin at the other, right? But what happened is once people started studying it the way Emanuel is, right, and the way I've done it, and other people, this really opened up the way for, you could start to generalize. And of course, in the era of big data, that became very, very appealing because we can do now in an afternoon that which would have taken months and months before. So that's really, I think, you know, and then of course, there's the opening of the archives in Eastern Europe. That's gigantic. And, you know, the people were, it was very, very difficult before. It's become much easier. It was, of course, it was even easier when the Russian archives were open. But, you know, thank goodness the Holocaust Museum in DC and Yad Vashem got a lot of those materials while they could. And that actually also made it more appealing for political scientists to jump back in. And of course, the historians paved the way too by doing so much terrific work. And that could also be used to be, you know, you could go back to their footnotes and run down their footnotes. And that was really fantastic stuff. So I think that's my main account. I could go on and on about that.
Thank you so much. That's really interesting in terms of the career choices that people made. we have a question for Emanuel from Joanna Sliva. What case studies that you think are missing from the study of wartime Romania?
Yeah, thanks, Joanna. Great to see you again. So that's a great question, and I'll answer it by saying this. So I've been talking to a few of my colleagues, and they were saying that, and they are right in that sense, that the research on Holocaust in Romanian occupied territories and Romania has developed quite a lot in the last decade or so or more. You have, compared to other cases, like for example Croatia, who has much less historians studying it than, for example, Romania. So they were saying how scholars have developed areas of study on the Holocaust in Romania from different perspectives, and that is true. However, if I were to give a few hints about what is missing, I would say that is quite a lot. Mostly, one, because like I said, you have this very strong intentionalist perspective of analyzing Ion Antonescu, which is fine. I don't blame that, because that is more of an empirically driven approach that comes from the early 2000s when that was needed, right? So it was needed to gather data, to look at the archives, like what Jeff said, that the archives opened, that it was important to get the data out there and study it. And so you get this very intentionalist approach, which many times neglects case studies, like, for example, pogroms. Like the pogrom of Iași is very well researched. Radu Ioani did a great job on that. But you have less pogroms, like, for example, the Bucharest pogrom, or Bucharest Massacre, how it was called. You had the Dorohoi Massacre. You have less research on, for example, the auxiliary police that went before the army in northern Bessarabia and Bukovina. That would be a great study. You have a very much lack, and this is what I decided to do. You have a lack in post-war trial and research, except for Andrei Muraru, who did a great job of doing an overall overview of Transnistrian trials. You don't really have much on the trials, and this is a very neglected subject. And I understand why, because this period, this transition period, 45 to 48, 44, 40, 48 is very much politically heated. It was, and it still is. So in that sense, I would say post-war trials, specific massacres and pogroms like Dorohoi and Bucharest, and especially analysis of auxiliary police and not of army personnel, which are different from the Romanian occupied territories. Those, I would say, are the ones that are less analyzed and which would merit a functionalist, more of a functionalist interpretation, looking at specific individuals, a bottom-up approach, and so on, and looking less at political leaders.
Thank you. The next bunch of questions, I think we can bundle them up together, are about absence and presence. For Jeff, about violence, distribution of violence. Marta is asking about the Sovietization, right, in eastern and southern Ukraine as an immunization against pogroms. We have a question from Miriam Kali asking about Jewish resistance. Are there any correlations between the mounting Jewish resistance in one locality and the absence of such occurrence of violence? And Natalia is asking about the aftermath, about the distribution. How can we measure these factors after the summer of 1941? And to what extent are these, how do individuals fit into these political categories of pre-war relations, roles and officials such as local priests in the unfolding of those pogroms?
There's a lot there. To Marta's question, which is an important one, why did you not have, or you had far fewer, and I think they're still being researched, the area is still being researched, but far fewer pogroms in southern and eastern Ukraine than you had in even central than in western Ukraine? I think there are a number of factors. One is the strength of the presence of the own the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists on the ground, which was much stronger in Western Ukraine than in Central and Eastern Ukraine. But I don't want to put too much weight on that because I think that tends in the historiography to, because if you look at the actual testimonies of the pogroms, it's not all people who are committing these atrocities who were nationalists, right? They were just ordinary people. So by kind of an own-centric view of these pogroms kind of lets the Narod off the hook more than I think they deserve to be for these. I mean, I don't mean to be too normative about it, but I think in terms of the analysis, it's got to be a much broader question than that. I think there's a military and a timing question too. The fact of the matter is that the Germans rolled through very quickly Western Ukraine, and they got kind of caught up in central Ukraine. And where they got caught up, the violence then tended to be associated with the Germans, right? But where the that is in June and July, right? But where the Germans were already not present anymore, or at least present very thinly on the ground, that is in Western Ukraine, the initial violence was carried out by local nationalists and their helpers. Let's just put it that way. And so there's that. Maron, God, great. I haven't seen Maron in a million years. Great to see him. So on resistance. So what's interesting is that I didn't find a lot of evidence for resistance, but, and here's the interesting thing. Pogroms tended to occur where according to just descriptively, where the Zionist parties did well, right? That is, they were most organized, most on the ground. What's interesting in a subsequent article on resistance, Yevgeny Finkel, which was published in the American Political Science Review, uses my data. We share all the data because you have to, right? That's normal science. He uses the data and he finds that, sorry, there's an ambulance out. Those places which had strong Zionist votes were most likely to have pogroms, he agreed, and they were most likely to have resistance. So and he calls it the Phoenix effect, right? Because they were kind of beaten down and they rise up, right? Now, I mean, the numbers here are, the data here is fuzzy, and I mean, it's all within the giant caveat of Holocaust research, but I think it is an interesting finding. What was Natalia's question? I can't remember.
I wonder if the political factors listed continue to shape the course of the Holocaust in the localities you studied. Is there a relatively higher number of rescuers in places that didn't have a pogrom in the summer of 1941?
So here's an interesting thing, which I've never done anything with this. I think that I may sick a graduate student on this, right? I think that since pogroms tended to occur where there were lots and lots of Jews, the memory of Jews is disproportionately there were pogroms, right? Where you had fewer Jews, you were less likely to have pogroms. That is, where you had, let's say, more Poles and Ukrainians proportionally. So their memory would have been disproportionately, as a population as a whole, of less pogroms. And so there may be a kind of a strange demographic cause for divergent memory. Now, I don't know how far I'd want to go with this. I've never done anything with it because it just may be bogus, but there is a significant, I don't know if that's exactly your question. No, I'm sorry.
But it's still interesting, so.
Yeah, I'm not very good at, okay, two questions. I wonder if the factors you continue to shape the course of Holocaust localities you studied. Yes, okay. There are economists who are looking at Eastern Europe and starting to look at the destruction of trust and social capital, right? Social capital is what sociologists basically call it, intercommunal trust. And some of them are starting to argue where you had pogroms, long-term economic development suffered more than in places you did not. I think that's an answer to your question. It may not be the answer. How do we, individuals who seem somewhat randomly to stop pogroms? So to repeat this question about rescue. So I'm not trying, of course, it takes a lot of guts to be a rescuer under these circumstances. There's no doubt. But I find it strange that the guts, if you will, the courage is non-randomly distributed. It's non-randomly distributed, that it appears to be much more closely tied to pre-existing relations within these communities. It was easier to be the good priest in some places. And indeed, in the testimonies where there were pogroms, the Jews often ran to the priest, and the priest said back to them, either you're all a bunch of Christ killers, or I'd like to help you, but I can't because I'll be thrown sort of, under the bus, if you will, into the mud if I do help you. And that is support for, what I think is a communal level explanation, as opposed to an individual level explanation that focuses on the ethics of the individual, which is how most historical scholarship on the Holocaust has looked at it. Who is the good priest and the bad priest? And then they try to look at, right, if they're sociologists, then they try to look at, well, what did the people who helped Jews, were they more likely to be rural than urban, rich versus poor, religious versus non-religious? Those categories have defeated sociologists, completely defeated, because those are individual level determinants. I'm looking at communal level determinants. And I think that that's somehow more promising, to use the title of Hillary Clinton's book, It Takes a Village, right? And so in this sense, it takes a village both to save a child, but it also takes a village to carry out a massacre. And I think both of those things are true.
And one last question for both of you. The question of Roma, asked by Kai Müller. So to embed this in a broader picture, were there also instances that you found against inter-ethnic violence against Roma, and the question of intimacy and networks here?
Go ahead, Emanuel.
And
yes, thank you for that. Well, that's an important question. However, it applies less to the Odessa case, mostly because there weren't many Roma in Odessa at the time. Most of the Roma that were in Transnistria were deported from Romania proper by the regime, be murdered in Transnistria in the camps. There were some local Roma people, but they were not directly, from what I found, they were not directly targeted, because Odessa was seen as a Jewish city in a negative terms by the Romanians. And they were used, for example, for works like disposing the bodies or things like that. So they were used at the same time for things that the Romanians didn't want to do, but they were not targeted as a target population in the massacre itself.
And in my case, I'm racking my brains. I can't think of any that come up in the sources that I've used. Right. And maybe it's just a function of, I don't know the geographic distribution of the Roma population at that time in that part of Europe. I'll be honest, that's my own limits of my knowledge. And so it's possible that either it's not in the sources and it should be in the sources, or it's not in the sources for good reasons, that they weren't there. Right. I just don't know.
And one last question that ties a little bit to where we started, actually, about the development of social science research. What is the idea of memory politics? How does that fit? Because inter-ethnic violence, communal violence, intimate violence, social dynamics, what are, to both of you, what are the implications for your research, and how does this tie to a question that Shmuel Yerushalmi asked about the Ukrainian nationalists and the current memory politics and the backlash? What are your experiences with that, and how does this inform the research in your case?
Well, there are a number of social scientists out there who are looking not only at the causes of violence, but the consequences of violence. And especially in the case of Poland, of Ukraine, people are looking at that. So in the case of Poland, for example, there's people who look at, so this is absolutely fascinating. Yevgeny Finkel and Volha Charnish have this article called Death Camp El Dorado. And what they showed is that they looked at Treblinka, right? And they said, look, it's where it's placed. It was not placed. There's nothing about Treblinka, which the area that's special, right? But if you draw concentric circles, 5-kilometer circles around Treblinka, decades later, the local population, as you get closer to Treblinka, has better housing and is wealthier. And what they argued was that the theft of Jewish valuables and the transactions between guards in the camp and the surrounding population, and most gruesomely, the digging up of the corpses after the war, led to a one-time gigantic transfer of wealth that had this long-term effect. And then they went on beyond that. They found that Polish extreme nationalist parties do better as you get closer to the site of the old Treblinka camp 70 years later. Absolutely remarkable. And it's quite systematic. Now, the effect is not gigantic, but in the context of pretty close elections, 3-4% matters a great deal. We know that in the United States. And so there is this long-term impact. And I think people are just starting to study it. There's a couple of scholars who've studied the effect. This isn't directly the Holocaust. This is more about the deportation of the Crimean Tatars and the long-term effect on Crimean politics. And people have done surveys of families, right, over the long run. What happens, those who were deported versus not deported. And that kind of research can be done for Holocaust survivors as well, in multi-generational survey research, looking at, do the sons and daughters and grandsons and granddaughters of Holocaust survivors have fundamentally different political attitudes? And that's being studied too right now. There's a lot of good research on that.
Yeah, just to add to what Jeff said about your last point, last few points regarding this idea of how we study. Like, look, like for example, I come more from the field within Holocaust studies, for example, of perpetrator study oriented research. However, there are a lot of people, even in social science research and especially in history, who look at, for example, at rescuers, or they look from they look at survivors and so on. So I think that, and I've been asked many times when I've been at various conferences, okay, but why talk also about survivors, less about perpetrators? Or some have told me talk about perpetrators and talk less about survivors. So I think that it's a matter of focus, and focusing, for example, on one aspect does not negate any other. And my second point is regarding Ukrainian nationalists, and I've been looking through the archives. Last time I was looking, I think this week, and I found quite a few memos, for example, and orders from Romanian generals on how to integrate Ukrainian nationals in the Romanian plan of dealing with in Romanian occupied territories. And what we come to see is that they had difficulty in dealing with Ukrainian nationalist groups, not only because they enlisted their help to killing Jews, but also because the Romanians were wondering how to go against them as well. So you get this very complicated scenario, at least in Romanian occupied territories, which is not at all black and white. Like who are better, the Romanians or the Ukrainians? Who treated worse Jews? Those are not questions that are relevant so much as it should be what was the relationship, for example, between the Romanian occupiers and the groups of Ukrainian nationals that they dealt with. And sometimes the Ukrainian nationalists tried to kill the Romanian army tried to respond. So it's really much context oriented. So I think that's what I have to say on that.
Well, we could sit another 3 hours with all the questions that we got. So thank you so much to both Jeff and Emanuel.
Thank you.
And as the tradition wants it, I will pass on to Boaz for some final words, as always.
Thank you very much. It was every time we have such an event, an academic event, I'm saying, wow, a lot of new stuff to study. a lot of things are happening. I think Holocaust studies is one of the most vibrant fields in history, academic history or social history, whatever. It's certainly something that is all the time growing and developing, having new insights and using new materials, looking with new eyes at things, perspectives at things. I would like, these are not things I have researched, but the issue of, I will say something about we heard from the idea of a functionalist versus intentionalists, okay? Like what we saw today is Holocaust from below and without Germans, without prime ministers and without Germans. Like, so this actually, if we looked at the Holocaust as a German project, do we now have a challenge to this? I think not. I think that generally a lot of the Holocaust was done from below. I mean, once the Germans passed through and the blood of the Jews is let, it's a free season, then a lot of things happen. I mean, this is encouraged by the authorities. We will have to go back to anti-Semitism. It seems the one constant thing is anti-Semitism. Although you can say some places anti-Semitism was not enough to do a pogrom because of all the data you collected and the different points, maybe. But still, the basic motivation is, we can see from the lower tier, like general down, Romanians and local Ukrainians, Belarusians, whatever, is certainly anti-Semitism in one sense of that. Now we know already that anti-Semitism, which we use now as a general term, and we don't mean the 19th century version versus whatever, always had economic aspects. You can see I was teaching Black Plague, the plague. And I gave a project to my students on sources of the church, on why there were some places with pogroms against the Jews, massacres against one. And the church itself says, guys, don't tell us you were doing this for Christianity. You had a very strong vested economic interest in getting rid of the Jews. Like, it's always connected, but the idea that there's one people that you can murder once the basic restrictions of civility are out, I think this is going throughout this story, which we are talking about. The other thing that is going is that, of course, we can't, the Holocaust was not only a German project. Now, of course, the word project is opposed to all we heard today, because these are a lot of things from below, but the Holocaust is not only about the Germans. This is something we knew, but I think these two lectures we heard are strengthening this. The Germans were certainly a minor player in this story, apart from giving permission for the massacres to occur, or like giving, like I said, an open season. But generally, we didn't hear much about Germans today, because this is so in a way you have a multinational or multi-ethnic project of getting rid of the Jews with allowances for different places and different, and I think it's interesting because otherwise I think the Holocaust from below can't be explained without this, with taking into account economics, political, social issues, which we can't ignore. But the basic, and I know also Ukrainians were killing Poles and Poles were killing Ukrainians like a lot during the war. But still, this massive waves of massacres happening when the Germans come in is certainly connected to, on one hand, to a very basic, I think, anti-Semitism, and to a very basic and a very new permission to kill. So I think this is what we saw. Of course, this is open to arguments and etc. But since I have the last words, then I will tell them. I will mention two things about our international work. We've decided to, as you see, we've decided to go on with our online project, although we already had a face-to-face conference last month. We think this is a very important platform, and just seeing you, the participants, and it's true. We are open to all sorts of ideas about how this can be done, new subjects, etc. We also have some other international projects running, which I will mention. We have the International Innovation and Entrepreneurship for Holocaust Memory course. We will teach this in the Israeli second semester, which is something around February, March. We'll teach this course, and it's open to students and scholars worldwide. And what we do, we teach how to do memory startups. And we do them in class, and we already have results. Things are happening, are being produced out of this course, and are being used in classrooms in Europe, and will be used all over with a new project that is running out now from the. So we are opening, we are actually giving academics the tools to think out of the box, to build a business model, to learn management skills for this, to build a project in the course. And we don't have a new page for the new course now. We will have it up sometime. But if you have any students, or if you're interested yourselves, be in touch, because we have a very wide spectrum of ages. And internationally, it's between 9 to 12 countries represented each course. It's a chance to meet people from all over, all stages of academic studies. And apart from that, we are also teaching regular academic courses abroad. We have Daniela and Yaron will teach next year in ASU, in Appalachian State University in the States, courses in their curriculum. We, by the way, in Western Galilee, I think I can say this with confidence, we have the biggest selection of Holocaust courses in any academic institution. Like, we teach so many different courses, not Holocaust 101. We teach a giant selection of Holocaust courses, like Holocaust and medicine, Holocaust and child rehabilitation after the Holocaust, day-to-day life in the ghettos, childhood in the Holocaust, whatever. I will put up a list on the web. We are really, we are really developing a lot of Holocaust teaching, and we have now institutions abroad which we barter courses with and teach places that don't have a big chance to give Holocaust courses to students. So we do overseas studies on the Zoom. And it turns out very nicely. We are growing with this, and we are open to any ideas from you about this. So thank you all. And it was, thank you to the speakers again. I learned a lot, and a lot of food for thought. Thank you. Now I know a lot of reading I have to do, which is challenging. But thanks again, and thank you for all the people coming into this seminar, and see you next time. Or when you're in Israel, or wherever, be in touch. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye. Have a nice
day. Thank you, everybody. Again, it was a real honor. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Bye.
Bye.